The war room of the Coalition flagship, Eternal Resolve, smelled like burned circuits and cold fear. Half the lights were out. The emergency strips along the floor gave off a low, pale glow that made everyone in the room look worse than they already felt. And everyone in that room already felt terrible. 7 admirals sat around the wide oval table. Each one represented a different species. Each one carried the weight of a fleet that was no longer whole. The Sulani admiral, Veyrak, sat at the head of the table. He was tall, gray-skinned, with long fingers that had never once trembled in battle. They were trembling now, just slightly, as he placed the tablet on the center of the table and opened the surrender document. The numbers on the wall screen told the whole story. 212 Coalition vessels had entered the Battle of Severin Gate that morning. 69 were still able to move under their own power. 44 were drifting dead in space. The rest were wreckage, debris, or simply gone. The Draketh Dominion fleet had lost 40 ships out of 630. They were barely touched. Their guns were still hot. Their formation was still perfect. Their fleet sovereign had already broadcast the surrender frequency 3 times, patient as a man who already knew the answer and was just waiting for the paperwork. The terms on the tablet were not generous, but they were not the cruelest terms Veyrak had ever read. The Draketh wanted 3 Coalition trade routes handed over, the formal surrender of 12 border systems, and a signed acknowledgement that the Coalition had lost the engagement. There would be no executions, no occupation forces on homeworlds. Just submission, recorded and transmitted across every open channel, so that every civilization in the known galaxy could see that the Coalition had knelt. Veyrak looked around the table. One by one, each admiral pressed their mark to the document. The Ket representative went first. Then the Sulari elder. Then the 2 Vorath commanders who signed without looking at each other. Then the Haresh diplomat who had argued against the war from the beginning, and who now looked more tired than anyone in the room. They all signed. Then Veyrak looked at the human. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cole was sitting at the far end of the table. He was a lean man in his late 30s, with short brown hair and a face that showed almost nothing. His uniform had a long scorch mark down the left sleeve from a plasma vent that had blown out near his station during the second wave of the battle. He had not changed. He was reading the surrender document slowly, line by line, with his lips pressed into a flat, quiet line. He set the tablet down. He did not sign it. Veyrak watched him for a moment. "Commander Cole," he said, his voice passing through the collar translator in flat Coalition standard. "Your government will be notified. This is the correct decision. Please sign." Cole looked up. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had just found a small error in a long calculation, the kind of error that nobody else had caught yet. "I'm not going to sign it," he said. The room went still. The Vorath commander, a broad-scaled officer named Heket, leaned forward with the look of someone trying very hard to be patient. "Commander, your forces in this sector are destroyed or scattered. The battle is over. What reason could you possibly have to refuse?" Cole nodded. "Our main fleet, yes," he said. "I know, that part's true." "Then what?" "Our Vanguard hasn't reported in yet," Cole said. No one spoke. Veyrak turned slowly and looked at the tactical display on the far wall. The area where the human Vanguard forces had last been tracked was dark and empty. Nothing moved there. No heat traces. Just silence and cold space. "Commander," Veyrak said, "carefully now. The Vanguard was tracked moving directly into the Draketh main formation, approximately 11 hours ago. They have not sent a signal since." "I know," Cole said again. 11 hours, Heket said slowly, in an active combat zone, against the front line of the Draketh fleet. "Commander, there are no survivors from a contact like that. The silence is the answer." Cole picked up the metal thermos sitting beside his chair. He unscrewed the cap. poured himself a cup of coffee, and set it on the table in front of him. The smell of it spread through the recycled air of the war room. No one said anything. They watched him take a slow sip. "They might have damaged comms," he said. "Or they're running silent on purpose. Or they're busy." He looked at the tablet again. The Vanguard doesn't always check in on schedule. They're not regular Navy. The Hresh diplomat ran the last sentence through their translator twice. "Then what are they?" Cole thought about it for a second. "Volunteers," he said. The word sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. Veyrak repeated it slowly, the way a person repeats a word in a language they are still learning. "Volunteers? You mean civilians?" "Mostly," Cole said. "Miners mostly, cargo haulers, some reserve militia, a couple of retired Navy who came back when the broadcast went out 12 days ago." He paused. "We sent an emergency signal, asking for anyone with a ship and a reason to show up at Severin Gate. The Vanguard is whoever answered." The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It was heavier. It pressed against the walls. Hackett stared at the dark patch of space on the tactical map, where 41 human ships had last been seen, flying directly into the teeth of the Drakath fleet. "Commander Cole," he said, "even if some of those ships somehow survived, and I do not believe they did, they would have to pass through 600 active warships to reach this position. That is not a rescue. That is just a longer death." Cole looked at the map. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the surrender document with 6 signatures on it and 1 blank space at the bottom. Then he looked at his coffee. "Yeah," he said, "that's true." He didn't say anything else. He did not give a speech. He did not explain what it meant to be human, or talk about willpower, or tell them that they were underestimating his people. He just settled back in his chair, held his coffee in both hands, and looked at the door like he was waiting for someone to walk through it. Outside the viewport, the wreckage of 200 ships turned slowly in the cold light of the Severin Gate's distant star. The Drakath fleet sat in perfect formation, 600 guns pointed at the silence, waiting for the surrender signal that had not come yet. Ethan Cole checked his watch. He waited. Fleet Sovereign Drethcowl had never written a victory speech before today. He had won battles, many of them, 41 campaigns in 30 years, across 9 star systems, against civilizations that had believed themselves strong enough to stand in his way. Not one of them had stopped him, but he had never written a speech, because speeches had always felt like unnecessary decoration on top of a job that simply got done. Today felt different. Today he decided a speech was warranted. He stood at the wide viewport of his command deck, aboard the Eternal Conquest, the largest warship in the Drakath fleet, and he looked out at the field of broken coalition ships, turning slowly in the dark. Wreckage everywhere. Hull plates, shattered engine cores, frozen debris clouds that caught the starlight and turned it into something almost beautiful, if you didn't think too hard about what it was. 630 Drakath warships sat behind him in clean, ordered lines. 40 ships lost. 40 out of 630. That was barely a bruise. The coalition had sent over 200 vessels into this battle. Fewer than 70 had survived. The rest were out there in the dark, slowly cooling. He spoke the words of his speech quietly to himself, feeling the shape of them. When the broadcast went out in a few hours, it would reach 17 star systems simultaneously. It would be heard by every civilization that had ever thought about resisting Drakath expansion. The message was simple. This is what happens. This is always what happens. His communications officer cleared his throat. "Sovereign, the coalition flagship has not yet transmitted the surrender signal." Drethcowl did not turn away from the viewport. "Give them more time. They are emotional creatures. They need a moment." "Yes, Sovereign." It was quiet on the command deck. The kind of quiet that comes after a long, hard job is finished. Officers reviewed damage reports. Medics moved through the corridors. Somewhere below decks, the engineering teams were already patching hull sections and logging repair orders. The fleet would be fully operational within 3 days. Clean, efficient, done. Then the tactical officer stopped talking mid-sentence. Drethkal noticed it, the way you notice when a sound you had stopped hearing suddenly disappears. He turned. Lieutenant Vethon, his senior tactical officer, was leaning over his console, with both hands pressed flat on the surface. He was staring at his screen with the focused, unblinking look of someone who has seen something they do not yet have words for. "Report," Drethkal said. Vethon looked up. "Sovereign, I have new contacts, emerging from the direction of Severin Gate's inner corridor, the side that leads deeper into human space." Drethkal walked over slowly. 41 new points of light had appeared on the edge of the display, moving in a loose wedge formation from the direction that, according to every piece of Draketh intelligence, led to nothing but human colony worlds, farming systems, mining operations, civilian infrastructure that hadn't even been scheduled for conquest yet because it wasn't considered important enough. "Identify them," he said. Vethon worked quickly. "No coalition registration codes, no military broadcast frequencies. Drive signatures are—" He stopped. He looked at the data again. He rechecked it. Then he looked up with an expression that Drethkal had never seen on the face of a veteran officer. It was confusion, mixed with something very close to disbelief. "Sovereign, the drive signatures are not military standard. They are civilian configurations. Freighters, industrial haulers. One appears to be a deep-core mining vessel. Another reads like a long-haul cargo carrier. The heat output is extremely high. They are all running well above rated engine capacity." The command deck went quiet again, but it was a completely different kind of quiet this time. Drethkal looked at the screen. 41 contacts. Moving fast. Moving very fast. Faster than any of the coalition warships that had fought that morning. Not because their engines were better, but because they were clearly being pushed far past the point where a sane engineer would have throttled back. The heat trails behind them burned bright on the passive sensors. "They sent workers," said Weapons Officer Krethval, from across the deck. He said it the way someone says something when they genuinely cannot figure out what else to say. Rethval, the oldest officer on the command deck, a commander who had served in 40 campaigns and who had the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had seen nearly everything, walked over and stood beside Drethkal. He studied the readouts for a long moment without speaking. 41 vessels, he said quietly. Civilian conversions, mining rigs, haulers, probably some kind of salvage or utility craft in there as well. They have been pushing those engines hard. 11, maybe 12 days of travel at above-rated speed, judging by the thermal degradation on those signatures. He paused. Someone fitted weapons to them. The energy profiles suggest rail-based kinetics and point defense clusters. Improvised. Fast to install, not elegant. He paused again. They are not slowing down. Drethkal looked at the speed readout. Rethval was right. The 41 ships were coming in fast, and they were not adjusting course, not decelerating, not sending any communication at all. They were just coming. He picked up the command channel. Broadcast a warning hail to the incoming vessels, all frequencies. His comm officer sent it out. They waited. Nothing came back. Fire a warning shot, Drethkal said. Across their forward line. Let them see it. One of the Draketh cruisers on the outer edge of the formation fired a single bright streak across the path of the incoming ships. A clear, visible warning. Every civilization Drethkal had ever fought had understood what a warning shot meant. The 41 ships did not slow down. They did not change course. They did not respond. They just kept coming, engines burning hot enough to light up every passive sensor in the fleet, flying in tight formation straight towards 600 Draketh warships, like the numbers on the screen meant absolutely nothing to any of them. Rethval watched the display for a long moment. His expression was hard to read. "Sovereign," he said very quietly, "I have fought humans before. Once, 12 years ago, on the edge of the Kethara Passage." He stopped, as if deciding whether to continue. "There is something you should understand about them. They are not brave in the way other species are brave. Other species become brave when they believe they can win. Humans become brave when they believe they cannot afford to lose. Those are very different things." He looked at the incoming contacts again. "Those ships are not coming to die. They are coming to make us regret that the battle ever started." Then he gave the order. Drethkal looked at the 41 burning engine trails on the screen. He looked at his 600 warships sitting in perfect formation around him. He thought about the speech he had written for 17 star systems. Then he gave the order to open fire. On the screen, the 41 ships did not stop. The bridge of the UES Iron Peak was not built to be a warship's bridge. It was built to manage the operations of a deep-core asteroid mining hauler. A long, heavy, ugly vessel designed to push through dense rock fields, drag out mineral loads the size of city blocks, and survive conditions that would crush a standard ship just from the pressure alone. The consoles were wide and practical. The seats were bolted down hard against the kind of turbulence that came from cracking open a spinning rock at close range. The viewport was thick, layered glass, rated for debris impacts. Nothing about it was elegant. Everything about it was built to last. Commander Nina Cross sat in the captain's seat and watched the Draketh fleet grow larger on the main screen. She was 34 years old, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the kind of focused calm that comes not from never being afraid, but from being afraid so many times that you learn to keep it small and put it somewhere it won't get in the way. She had spent 8 years running mining operations in the outer belt systems. She had pulled crews out of cave-ins, pressure failures, reactor vents, and one very memorable collision with an unmapped rock the size of a sports stadium. She knew how to manage a bad situation. This, she was aware, was a significantly worse situation than any of those. 600 Draketh warships sat ahead of her on the display. They were opening fire now, long, bright lines of energy weapons cutting across the dark in warning patterns. The first real shots were starting to fall short of the Vanguard formation, but not by much. Nina opened the ship-wide channel. "This is Cross," she said. Her voice came out of every speaker on every deck of the Iron Peak. The engine room, the cargo bays, the converted weapons stations, the cramped crew quarters where off-shift people had been trying to sleep for the past 12 days. "I'm going to keep this short, because we don't have much time, and I don't think any of you need a long speech to understand what we're doing here." She looked at the screen. "The Coalition fleet is pinned behind us. They sent a surrender signal out earlier today. Our liaison officer didn't sign it. He told them our Vanguard hadn't reported in yet, and he was right, because here we are." She paused. "The Draketh think this battle is finished. They think we're the kind of people who stop when the numbers go bad. We're going to show them what we actually are." She looked down at her console for a second, then back up. "We've got 41 ships, and we're going up against 600. Yes, I know what that sounds like. But those 600 ships are sitting still, waiting to receive a surrender. They are not in attack formation. They are not expecting a second fight. And we are not going to give them time to get ready for one." She let that land. "Every ship in this formation has one job: close the distance. Get inside their targeting range before they can reset their formation. Do not slow down. Do not give them space to breathe." She looked at the screen one more time. "The Coalition fleet is out there. Our people are out there. Let's go get them." Then she turned to her helmsman, a young man named Danny Cole. no relation to the liaison officer, who had been a cargo pilot on the outer runs before answering the emergency broadcast, and who had, in the 12 days since, become one of the steadiest pilots Nina had ever seen. "Full burn," she said. "Hold the wedge formation. Don't let anyone drift wide." Danny's hands moved across the console. The Iron Peak's engines, 4 massive deep-core drives that had been designed to haul 200,000 tons of raw ore through asteroid fields, opened up to full power. The whole ship shook. The lights on the bridge flickered once. Somewhere below, someone shouted something that got lost in the engine roar. And the Vanguard charged, 41 ships burning hot, flying in tight formation towards 600 Draketh warships. The energy weapons coming at them now were no longer warning shots. Real fire was cutting across the void. 2 Vanguard ships took hits in the first 30 seconds. The UES Borderline, a cargo hauler out of the Titan runs, lost an engine pod and began trailing fire, but held formation. The UES Grey Mountain, a utility tug that had been fitted with 4-point defense turrets by her crew of 14, took a glancing hit along her port side and kept moving. None of them stopped. The Draketh had better weapons. They had better targeting systems. They had ships that were actually designed to fight. But they had been sitting still in a post-battle formation, their targeting computers calibrated for a mop-up operation, not a high-speed incoming assault. And the Vanguard ships were moving in ways that proper warships did not move. Erratic. Fast. Varying their speeds and angles in patterns that no military computer would generate, because no military computer would be this reckless. They got inside the Draketh outer formation in 4 minutes. What followed after that was not elegant warfare. Sergeant Leon Archer was already moving by the time the Iron Peak hit hard deceleration and locked against the side of the Draketh destroyer Veth Karas with a crash that rattled every bone in his body. He was the first one through the mag clamp breech collar that his team had spent 2 of the 12 travel days welding together from salvage parts, pressure seals, and whatever else they could find in the Iron Peak's repair stores. Leon was not a soldier by training. He was a mine security officer from the belt. He was big, practical, and hard to rattle. He had 12 people behind him. The destroyer they were boarding held 400 Draketh combat troops. He knew the number. He went anyway. Behind him, Nina was already managing 3 different crises at once. 2 Draketh cruisers were closing on the Iron Peak. Her weapons officer was calling out targeting solutions, and her chief engineer, Pete Calloway, was on the intercom telling her in his usual flat, unhurried voice that the port engine was running hot enough to fail within the next 20 to 25 minutes. "Push it to 25, Nina told him. "I'll try for 23, Pete said, completely seriously, and went back to work. On the Coalition flagship in the dim war room, the sensor screens lit up like someone had thrown a stone into still water. Admiral Veyrak stood slowly from his chair. All around the table, the other admirals were getting to their feet, staring at the displays where 41 small contact markers were now inside the outer ring of the Draketh formation and moving fast in every direction. Veyra looked at Ethan Cole. Cole had set down his coffee. He was leaning forward in his chair, looking at the screen with a quiet, focused expression. Not surprised, not triumphant, just watching, the way a man watches something he expected to happen and is simply glad to see happen on time. "You'll want to hold off on transmitting that surrender signal," Cole said. No one at the table moved to transmit it. The corridors of the Draketh destroyer Veth Karas were dark and narrow and smelled like metal and something sharp that Leon Archer couldn't name. He moved fast, low, with his team spread out in a 2x2 stack behind him. They had made it 30 meters from the breach point before the first Draketh soldiers found them. The contact was close and loud and lasted about 12 seconds before Leon's team pushed through it and kept moving. One of his people, a young woman named Carla, who had worked oxygen systems maintenance on a mining platform before answering the broadcast, had taken a hit on her shoulder armor. She was still walking. She told Leon she was fine. He believed her because he needed to. Leon had no real plan beyond getting to the engineering deck and holding it. The engineering deck of a warship was the most important room on the ship. Reactors, drive controls, life support junctions. If you held engineering, the ship couldn't easily maneuver, couldn't jump, couldn't do half of what it needed to do in a fight. You didn't need to control the whole destroyer. You just needed to make it useless to the people who owned it. The Draketh soldiers defending the ship were good. They were trained, they were armed with better weapons, and they knew every corner of their own vessel. They had 400 troops aboard, and they were using all of them. Leon's team hit 2 more contact points in the first 5 minutes, working through tight corridor intersections where the Draketh kept trying to set up crossfire positions. The thing that kept saving Leon's team was simple and a little strange. The Draketh soldiers kept expecting them to fall back. Every time Leon's team took fire and people went down to cover positions, the Draketh adjusted their formation to push forward and exploit what they expected to be a retreat. Instead, Leon's team went sideways, through maintenance hatches, through service corridors that were barely wide enough for a person wearing gear, through ventilation junctions that the Draketh soldiers hadn't bothered to cover because no military doctrine on record told you to guard your air ducts against boarding troops. It was not elegant. It was not what Leon had been trained to do, because Leon had never been trained to do this at all. He was making it up as he went, using the same instincts he used in mine tunnels. Find the path the other person didn't think to close. Move toward the thing you need. Don't stop moving. They reached engineering in 11 minutes. They took the room in 40 seconds, of very loud, very close work that Leon would not remember clearly afterward. They set up a perimeter around the reactor junction, with everything they had left, and they held it. 3 of his 12 people were down, 2 wounded, 1 dead. Leon did not look at the dead one. He would look later. Right now he pressed into the junction wall, checked his weapon, and waited for the next wave of Draketh to come through the door. The cut above his eye from a piece of flying console debris was bleeding freely down the side of his face. He had not noticed it yet. On the Iron Peaks Bridge, Nina Cross was fighting a different kind of battle. 2 Draketh cruisers had locked targeting solutions onto the Iron Peak, and were working together to cut off her ability to maneuver. They were doing it well, staggering their fire so that every time Nina dodged one stream of incoming weapons, the second cruiser had already adjusted. The Iron Peak's hull was taking hits. Damage reports were coming in from 4 different decks. A fire had started in Cargo Bay 3, and the automated systems were handling it, but only just. "Port engine," Pete Calloway said over the intercom, in the calm voice of a man reporting a weather forecast, "is going to fail in about 8 minutes, give or take." "Give me 10, Nina said. "I can give you 9 if I bypass the thermal regulators entirely, but then the engine will probably take part of the aft hull section with it when it goes." "Bypass the regulators. Aim the failure away from crew quarters." A short pause. "That's creative," Pete said. Then he went to work. Nina pulled the Iron Peak into a hard banking turn that the navigation computer flagged as structurally risky, and that she executed anyway. She brought the ship's port side, the side with the dying engine, directly toward the closer of the 2 Draketh cruisers. The cruiser's targeting system had been calibrated for a retreating or evading target. A ship accelerating directly toward it, on a collision course, was not in the parameters. The cruiser broke left. Nina went right. She bought herself 40 seconds of clear space, and used it to bring the Iron Peak's railguns to bear on the second cruiser's engine section at close range. The second cruiser began to drift. "Engine's going," Pete said. "Now's fine," Nina said. The port engine went. It took the aft lower hull section with it, in a controlled venting explosion that Pete had aimed, as instructed, away from the crew decks. The Iron Peak lost 40% of its drive power in 3 seconds. It also briefly looked on every sensor screen in the Draketh fleet like it had been destroyed. The first cruiser came back around to confirm the kill. Nina was already using the remaining 3 engines to swing the Iron Peak's bow toward it. In the Coalition war room, Ethan Cole was standing now. He was standing at the main sensor display, with Admiral Veyrak beside him, watching the battle unfold in real time. It was not going the way any conventional war model would have predicted. 41 underarmed, jury-rigged civilian ships should have been wiped out in the first pass. Instead, they were inside the Draketh formation, moving in every direction at once, and the Draketh fleet was doing the one thing it had not expected to do today: reacting, adapting, trying to deal with 41 different problems simultaneously instead of standing in formation and receiving a surrender. Veyrak watched a human cargo hauler lock onto a Draketh frigate at point-blank range and begin a boarding action while still taking fire from a third vessel. He watched a small utility ship place itself directly between 2 Draketh cruisers and use them against each other, letting their own fire create problems for their allies. He watched ship after ship take damage, lose systems, slow down, and then keep fighting anyway. "They are not falling back," Veyrak said quietly. "No," Cole said. "Any of them." "That's correct." Veyrak was quiet for a moment. "In our doctrine," he said slowly, "when a unit takes more than 30% casualties, it withdraws and requests relief. It is how you preserve fighting capacity." "I know," Cole said. "What is the human doctrine?" Cole thought about it. "When a unit takes heavy casualties, it figures out what it still has left, and it uses that." Veyrak looked at the display for a long time. "That is a very small philosophical difference," he said, "that produces a very large practical result." On the screen, the Draketh formation, which had been a clean, orderly 600 ships sitting in perfect post-battle order, was beginning to cluster. Vessels pulling toward each other for mutual support, trying to create a defensive wall against the chaos in their midst. It was the right call by any standard playbook. And Captain Marcus Webb of the UES Coaltown Breaker, sitting 4,000 kilometers back from the main engagement in a reserve position with 4 ships, had been watching for exactly that moment. Webb was not loud. He was not dramatic. He was a 50-year-old man from the outer asteroid runs, who had 3 adult children and a very old dog waiting for him back home, and who had come out here with one specific job in mind. He had 2 long-range mass drivers bolted to the upper spine of his ship, stripped from a decommissioned orbital defense platform, and mounted by his crew with a combination of engineering skill and absolute determination. He watched the Draketh cluster form up into a tight, mutually reinforcing wall of hulls. The gunner looked back at him. Webb said, "Fire." The mass driver rounds from the UES Coaltown Breaker crossed 4,000 kilometers of open space in a little under 3 seconds. They hit the clustered Draketh formation like 2 thrown stones hitting a still pond, except the pond was made of warships and the ripple was made of fire. The rounds did not destroy the formation. They didn't have to. They hit 2 Draketh cruisers along their upper hull sections and carved through plating that had been designed to handle energy weapons, not solid kinetic rounds moving at that speed. The resulting explosions were large enough to force 3 nearby ships to break formation to avoid the debris. The cluster came apart. It was not the thing that ended the battle by itself. It was the thing that ended the calculation. Fleet Sovereign Drethkal stood at the center of his command deck and looked at the tactical display and did the math for the first time in the way that the math actually looked, instead of the way he had wanted it to look. His 600 ships were no longer in a coherent formation. They were spread across a 4,000-kilometer engagement zone, responding to 41 different threats in 41 different directions. 7 of his ships had been boarded and were either taken or contested. His cruiser screen was broken. 2 of his capital ships had taken damage that would require weeks of dock time. He had lost 40 ships in the battle against the Coalition fleet. He had now lost, or effectively lost, 19 more, to a force 1/15 his size in under an hour. The 41 human ships were still there. Most of them were damaged. Several were venting atmosphere or trailing debris. The Iron Peak, which his targeting systems had briefly classified as destroyed, had turned back up on sensors 3 minutes ago, with 3 engines instead of 4, flying at a hard angle that suggested major structural damage on one side, and absolutely no intention of stopping. One of his destroyers was broadcasting an internal distress signal, which meant its own crew had lost control of it. 30 years of campaigns, 62 civilizations. He had never lost a war he started. He thought about what Rethval had said on the command deck before the shooting started, about the difference between a species that becomes brave when it believes it can win, and a species that becomes brave when it believes it cannot afford to lose. He had not really listened at the time. The number difference had seemed too large to matter. 600 against 41 was not a contest. It was a conclusion. He understood now what the difference was. A species that fights because it believes it can win will eventually find a point where the math says it cannot win. And at that point, it stops. It is logical. It is correct. A species that fights because it cannot afford to lose does not find that point, because for them the math never changes. Losing was never an option in the first place. So the math that points toward losing does not register the same way. You could not outcalculate people who are not calculating. Drethkow looked at the tactical display for a long moment. He looked at the Iron Peak, still burning on 3 engines, still moving. He looked at the boarding markers on 4 of his ships. He looked at the scattered remains of his once perfect formation. Then he gave the order to withdraw. It came out quietly. No drama, no rage. Just the order, spoken in a flat voice, and the immediate response of his officers, who had clearly been waiting for it. The Draketh fleet began its retreat. Ships peeled away in groups, lining up for FTL jumps. The massive vessels disappeared from the sensor display one by one, their drive signatures flaring bright and then gone. In less than 8 minutes, 600 warships had reduced to 400, then 200, then 50, then nothing. The field went quiet. Leon Archer was sitting on the floor of the engineering deck of the Vethkaras when the Draketh troops inside the ship stood down. Word had come down from whatever command structure was left aboard that the fleet was retreating and the boarding action was over. The remaining Draketh soldiers in the corridor outside engineering had stopped firing and were holding position. Leon's team held their own position for another 3 full minutes before anyone moved, because none of them quite trusted that it was real. Then one of his people said, quietly, "I think it's done." Leon looked around the engineering room. 9 of his 12 people were still on their feet. 2 were wounded and sitting against the wall with field dressings on. 1, a man named Porter who had driven ore transports for 6 years before this, was not getting up. Leon sat there for a moment. He pressed the capture signal on his comm unit and transmitted it. Then he leaned his head back against the reactor junction wall and let out a long, slow breath. He reached up to wipe sweat off his forehead, and his hand came away dark red. He looked at it. He found a med patch in his kit and stuck it over the cut above his eye, without much ceremony. It was only then, in the quiet after everything, that he noticed his hands were shaking slightly. That was allowed. Now, on the Iron Peak, Nina Cross sat in her captain's seat and watched the last Draketh ship jump out of sensor range. The bridge was a mess. 2 consoles were dark. One of the viewport panels had cracked along its upper edge and was holding, but only just. She had damage reports from 9 decks. The port engine section was gone entirely. Pete Calloway had, as promised, aimed the failure away from crew quarters, and the aft hull section had blown outward into space instead of inward. Remarkable work, given the circumstances. She opened the ship-wide channel again. "Cross here," she said. The Dracket fleet has withdrawn from Severin Gate. The engagement is over. She stopped for a second. We lost people today. I'm not going to pretend we didn't, or that it doesn't matter, because it does. We'll have time for that later. She paused again. For now, good work. Every single one of you. That's all. She looked out the cracked viewport at the slowly drifting debris field where the battle had been. In the Coalition war room, nobody had spoken for several minutes. The sensor screens showed an empty field. The Dracat fleet was gone. The 41 human Vanguard ships were still there, scattered, battered, some of them barely recognizable as ships anymore, but still there, still broadcasting, still responding to hails. Admiral Veyrak stood at the display screen with his long fingers at his sides and looked at the battlefield for a long time. He had fought in 4 wars. He had studied military history for 50 years. He had read about 100 different species approaches to combat, to courage, to the decision to keep fighting when the numbers were bad. He was not sure he had a category for what he had just watched. He turned to Ethan Cole. Cole was standing beside him, looking at the screen with the same quiet, focused expression he had worn throughout. The coffee thermos was back in his hand. The surrender document was still on the table behind them, unsigned, with the thermos cap sitting on top of it like a small, informal paperweight. Veyrak looked at him for a long moment before speaking. His translator processed the question twice before it came out in Coalition Standard, because the original Sulani phrasing did not map cleanly to any equivalent structure. "Did you know they would come?" he asked. "At the 41 scarred ships sitting in the debris field where 600 Dracket warships had been an hour ago." He thought about it honestly. "I knew they'd try," he said. "That's usually enough." Veyrak looked at the screen again. He thought about the miners, and the cargo haulers, and the retired Navy officers who had answered an emergency broadcast 12 days ago, and driven their converted ships past the limits of their engines, across 11 light-years to reach this fight. He thought about the boarding teams, and the engineers who had bypassed safety overrides, and the small ship that had put itself between 2 cruisers and let them shoot each other. He thought about the man who had sat in a broken war room and poured himself a coffee and simply waited, because he knew something the rest of them had not known. "Humans are very strange," Veyrak said. Cole picked up the surrender document from the table. He folded it once and tucked it in his jacket pocket. "Yeah," he said, "we get that a lot." Outside the viewport, the Vanguard ships were moving slowly through the debris field, broadcasting search signals for survivors, beginning the long and careful work of the aftermath. They were dented, scarred, and held together in places by things that had no business being structural components. They looked like exactly what they were: civilian ships crewed by ordinary people who had chosen, freely, to come here.